Hare Krishna. So we're back. Welcome back to at least in the US, it's the Saturday afternoon session of the mentor retreat. First time we've ever attempted this online. So hopefully it's working well for everybody there. I think you're all at home. Might be a few people in the office today. Some of you may be gathered around with the one or two friends, but it's great to have you here for this session. The very next session we're going to have is going to be led by Partha Prabhu, who I'd like to introduce. Partha and I have been working together with some work with the Grihastha Vision Team. I haven't done much, but I've known him in his capacity for that for many, many years. And he's been one of the pillars of organizing these mentor retreats, which we held in New Vrindavan in the past 2 years before we went virtual this year. So I'll read a little bit of an introduction to him and then add a couple comments. And this is from Partha's self-written description, which I think makes it particularly beautiful, at least the first few lines. I think you'll see that because we're here to talk about marriage and the opportunities as well as the challenges that it presents for men. So Partha Das married a beautiful, kind, and devotional girl in the last term of high school in 1971. And they've been together ever since, in case you're having some doubts before I read the rest of the description. Upon graduating, they left together on a spiritual quest, which culminated in taking initiation from Srila Prabhupada in 1973. Partha then served as the head Bajari for Sri Sri Radha Madan Mohan in Vancouver, Canada for close to 20 years, and he was a board member there during part of that time. And then he got involved with the Grihastha Vision Team beginning in 2004, so that's 16 years now. With his wife of 49 years now, they have facilitated these Grihastha Vision Team seminars in 21 countries. So they travel together all around the world to strengthen people in their marriages and premarital, helping people overcome problems that they may face in their marriages and also how to maximize their relationships in a Krishna conscious context. So in that capacity, they've literally mentored hundreds of couples over the years. He's also certified in the Dasi Ziyad Family Institute. Krishna Nandini, who sadly just passed away recently, that's the institute that she and her husband had developed. And they administer, Partha and his wife Uttam, administer premarital and marriage spiritual strengths-based relationships program and other skill-based programs to different marital therapists. So he's got a lot of professional training and he's done a lot of training. And he's traveled around the world to share what he knows and to help strengthen marriages within ISKCON. And in addition to that, he's a real exemplar because he's been married for 49 years. We should probably ask him when his anniversary is. So maybe we should have a special mantra retreat mini version to celebrate whenever his 50th anniversary is coming up soon. So with that, I'd like to pause the introduction and turn it over to Partha Prabhu. I know he's got a very interesting program. I think there's going to be some small group discussions and maybe even some polls and quizzes and things like that for us. And at least on my screen now, I don't know if you're all seeing it, I'm looking at Ananda Madhava Prabhu, who is our techie, who's done a lot of the work behind everything. So thank you, Ananda Madhava, for making sure everything comes together nicely. Okay, Partha Prabhu, take it away.
Thank you very much. Maon Vishnu Padaya, Krishna Pastaya Bhutale, Srimati Bhakti Vedanta Swamanitnamane. Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharane, Nirvishesha Sunyavadi Pastachade Satarane, Oma Ganati Miranda Jananjanan Shmakaya, Chakshurum Militam Dina Tazmai Shri Gurave Namaha, Mukam Karati Vachalam, Pangam Langa Tegirim, Yat Kripatam Ahamade, Shri Gurum Dinataranam. So time is a very, very precious commodity. I'm sure we've all had an experience where something bad has happened and we wish we could just turn the clock back. You cannot do that. There's no amount of money, there's no valuable commodity that can purchase the time that we have lost. So time is very, very extremely valuable. And I just want to honor the fact that you're all here and you're investing your invaluable time in participating in this mantra retreat. And I'm here in great fear praying, praying to Krishna that I may not disappoint you and waste your time by. So I pray I can do something to help add value to your lives. So I'm just going to open with my PowerPoint here. So we'd like to explore men, marriage, and myths, and look at truths that actually support us in our roles as husbands and fathers. I'd also like to look at myths that mislead, enigmas that bewilder, and negative paradigms that hinder. So a myth is something that's a widely held view that is not true, or a misrepresentation of the truth. And looking at contemporary politics, most political dialogue these days is actually all myths. Actually, there was one famous dictator, tyrant, who was famous at saying, if you tell a lie enough times, people will believe it. And an enigma is something which is simply very, very bewildering. During the Second World War, they had very complex machines that looked like some huge, complicated typewriter that would scramble communication so no one could read it. And the machines were called enigmas. So it's something very hard to decipher. And paradigms are a view that we have of the world that accepts our influence. So we'd like to examine how myths and paradigms can affect us, and also like to try to unravel some of these enigmas. So here's an interesting myth. There's a product called Red Bull. This company was actually extremely successful marketing company. And they produced a product and began marketing on the basis of Red Bull gives you wings. And it was continuously marketed with images of extreme athletes and extreme sports. And the athletes are surrounded by voluptuous young women. And so the whole thrust of the advertisement was that by consuming this product, it's going to increase your athletic ability. And the company was extremely successful. But somewhere along the way, someone did some research and they actually found that the product actually gave no perceivable ability to increase any athletic ability. And they launched a lawsuit, and they actually won the lawsuit, and the company had to pay individuals $13 million. And so because of this, the company, the previous tagline was Red Bull gives you wings, spelled with one I. And after they were sued, they kept the same tagline and they put 3 I's in the word wings. So there's no such thing as W-I-I-I-N-G-S, but they kept that as their tagline. And so is it a myth? 100% it's a myth. Did that myth have influence? It sure had influence. Red Bull's net income to this day, even many years after that lawsuit, they're bringing in over $800 million a year. So myths are very powerful. They create paradigms and ideas that we can internalize, and those internalized ideas tend to give direction to our lives in positive and negative ways. And I'd like to look at one myth that was very prevalent in the 60s, 70s, 80s, less in the 90s, less in 2000, and it's still somewhat prevalent a little bit. And that is that marriage is a deep, dark well. So Srila Prabhupada, in his books and in our Shastra, it does say that marriage is a deep, dark well. But this statement is referring to materialistic household life, which is devoid of any sense of loving service to God. So that is a deep, dark well. There's no direction. There's no hope of getting out of that well unless one takes the spiritual life. But due to immaturity in our understanding of Krishna consciousness and its application, this statement was used as a blanket statement for all types of married life, including Krishna conscious Grihastha married life. And so that's problematic. That's problematic because A, it's not true, because the Grihastha ashram, Bhaktivinoda Thakur said that the Grihastha ashram is a very noble ashram for making spiritual advancement. Srila Prabhupada told our god sister Jamuna once, she actually was one of the first prominent devotees to go and live outside of the temples, and she did it with her good friend Dina Tarne. They were living separately from ISKCON. And they asked Srila Prabhupada about this, and Srila Prabhupada told them that any ashram is a factory for producing devotion. An ashram is a situation for producing loving service to Krishna. But what happens with this negative paradigm, as I was mentioned earlier, if you say something enough, people will believe it. So we may have been exposed to this myth that all married life is Maya. And so if you repeatedly hear this, it starts to enter into your consciousness. And so for Grihasthas, they've been exposed to this, and maybe they didn't fully believe it, but they heard it enough times. And in reality, Grihastha life faces challenges and difficulties, and it's not always easy. And for those who are exposed to those negative attitudes and paradigms and have heard that, at those times in their life when they experience those kind of normal challenges, they might start to believe that, well, maybe this is actually Maya. Maybe my household life is actually a deep, dark well. I just received some letters, and I'm communicating with a devotee in another country. He was from India, his wife is from somewhere in Europe. They ended up in a totally different country with no relatives there, and his wife had twins. So he's working, the wife's home with twins, no support, and this young man is just thinking, I should just give this all up. You cannot give up your household life like that. You have to take it as a responsibility and a challenge from Krishna. But he's been exposed to these negative myths about marriage, that it's a deep, dark well, and he's starting to believe it. So those kind of influences, they can be very subtle and they can affect us. And it's very important that we can be perceptive and objective and examine the influences that are coming toward us and be able to understand whether is that influence favorable, is that acceptable to my values, or is it something that I should filter or just completely reject? And we're all familiar with Srila Prabhupada's statement of purpose, in which he stated how through a systematic process of education, he wanted to correct the imbalance of values in society to create peace and tranquility. So having a firm value system enables us to see that this doesn't really line up with my values. So for Grihastha, one of their values is that their ashram is a very important part of their spiritual life. And back here. So I'd just like to go have Ananda Madhava put up our first poll here. We have a question for you. Is this true or false? Marriage and family life are different than direct devotional service. So you click on one. Is it true? Is it false? Or you're not sure? So if everyone can do that, we'll just give you a minute to get the results.
So we have about 60% of us who voted.
Okay.
If any, yeah. Do you want me to share the results or give it a
yeah,
few
but
more?
just keep that up on the screen for a minute. So,
Okay.
so 75% of you identified that this was false, and that's very encouraging to know that devotees are realizing this, the importance of their ashram. It's still a little concerning that some people think it is actually true, that your married life is actually different than your spiritual life. And still as devotees, there was a significant 15% who are not sure. And that's something that's that needs to be addressed in our society. So let me go back to the slideshow. So here's a quote from Srila Prabhupada. He was asked once if raising children was enough service. That this was actually Mataji. She asked, well, I'm raising children. Should I do something more like temple service or something more direct? And so Srila Prabhupada gives a very interesting, very important reply. So Prabhupada says, just like electrification, touching electricity by one wire, another joining another wire, if the touch is there factual, then the electricity is everywhere. Similarly, if our Krishna consciousness is rightly connected, then there is no question of direct or indirect, because absolute world, there is no difference. As soon as it is touched with a direct connection, there is no question of direct or indirect. So I think this also relates to what Bhutta Bhavana was talking about, empowerment, and in terms of short-term goals. And I like to think sometimes in terms of nanoparticle goals, because ultimately in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, in all activities just depend upon me. He doesn't say just when you're on the edge of a cliff, just when you have some important decision to make, but he says actually in all activities. So especially for Grihasthas, it's very crucial that they see the sanctity and the importance of their ashram and their family, and especially as us, as husbands and fathers, to see the very great onus of responsibility that's upon us in our lives, literally from moment to moment, to be the best person we can be, to be the best father, to be the best husband. And as Bhutta Bhavana was saying so profoundly, we may have a certain amount of ability to do that, and it may be difficult to do that. And we may be going against the tide, especially in today's age. Your father, you're working, your kids are crying when you come home. There's like so many challenges. So the tide is going against you. But because as Vaishnavas, if we can see that our ashram is an extremely important part of Srila Prabhupada's mission. Every individual Grihastha ashram, every single household, every husband has an extremely important part in supporting the entirety of Krishna's mission. So Grihastha ashrams, they're like the building blocks of society. If you want to talk about Varnashram, Grihastha ashram are like the foundational building blocks on which the rest of the society is built upon. If your Grihastha ashram is unstable, you'll never build you'll never have a stable society. So we all actually have that responsibility. And again, this is why I'm trying to point out that if you think that your responsibility as a father, a husband, is different than your devotional service, you are losing the ability to tap into that empowerment, which can come if we realize that, Krishna, this is difficult, you have to help me. That we can pray to Krishna to help us become better fathers and husbands. So again, it's extremely important to see how we're influenced by these negative paradigms, even in subtle ways, and it can cause us to think that our situation as a father or husband is something different than our devotional service. I'd like to, can you bring up the second poll now? So, do healthy marriages have conflicts?
Did you want me to share it, Prabhu?
You can share it, yes. Sorry, I was seeing it, so I was assuming everyone was seeing it. So, good. We have 96% identified that that's true. So that's very healthy to realize that, yes, within healthy marriages, there can be conflict, and conflict is normal. There was a small percent, 4% said they weren't sure. So that's quite encouraging to see that devotees have realized that. And so it's actually normal to have challenges within marriage. And as above, when I was saying, again, these kind of challenges are opportunities for us to take shelter of Krishna and to make spiritual advancement. And also somehow how we view these things. Like, that was a very enlightening video of the little candy and the hands flying around, the little duck sneaking in. And so what's actually going on in that picture? Many things we don't see. So we may be perceiving that we have a conflict in our marriage. Excuse me. But in the bigger picture, there was actually another hand that came into that picture, which is actually Krishna, whom we understand is moving every blade of grass within the entire universe. So when some situation arises in our life, arises in our marriage, and he seems to create some conflict, there must be a greater purpose. And I actually prefer to use the word challenge instead of conflict, because conflict implies that it is very onerous, whereas challenge implies that it's doable. So by looking at things in a little different perspective and seeing that there's more hands at play than just ours and our spouses, can greatly help. So changing perspective is very important. One time I took a bunch of the youth here hiking in the mountains near here, and I looked at the map to see if the hike was doable. And so a part of the trail, there was a really big elevation difference, which meant there was going to be a lot of climbing. And I was a little concerned that this might be a little difficult or even dangerous because there was kids like maybe 14 years old. But the name of that part of the trail, it was called Devil's Stairway. So Devil's, it sounds like it's pretty onerous, but Stairway made it sound like it was doable. If that part of the map would have said Stairway to Hell, I probably would have said, I'm not taking these kids there. So how things are phrased and how we look at them can actually help us in navigating the situations. So also in conflict, one thing that's important to understand, different individuals handle conflict differently. And some people are avoiders, and they just want to avoid conflict, so they concentrate on the things they have in common. And that's okay in some ways. And couples who, you can close that poll now. So avoiders can be peaceful in their marriages, but the one problem with being avoiders is that sometimes there may be issues that you don't bring up out of a fear it's going to bring a conflict or challenge, and those things never get resolved. So it's not the best situation to be an avoider. It can keep things peaceful, but it's better to learn how to get skills to address challenges in ways in which you can both feel comfortable in navigating those conflicts or challenges. Another type of individuals who deal with conflict are couples who are, they're called volatile, who are they tend to be very loud and animated when they're engaging in some kind of dialogue over a difference. And there's many couples who can have successful marriages who are volatile in their dealings with challenges and conflict, but they do this in a way in which they inject humor, there's mutual respect, there's no name calling, there's no put downs, and they can be happily engaged in marriage, despite the fact that they're volatile. There's another type of couples who you would call hostile. They become volatile, and there's name calling, there's putting down, there's bitterness, resentment, resent, and contempt. And those are actually precursors of divorce. So again, conflict, it's not necessarily an impediment to service if we manage it properly. So it's very important to see in our marriages that we have healthy communication, whatever style it is, and learn to navigate these different kinds of challenges. And also for couples where one couple is maybe more volatile and one is more a withdrawer, they're going to have to learn to respect each other's styles if they want to have a successful and peaceful marriage. But again, this involves healthy communication. So I'm just going to show an interesting quote by Srila Prabhupada here. Srila Prabhupada, March 72, March 31st. Actually, when husband and wife fight, it shouldn't be taken very seriously. Just like sometimes in the morning, there will be thundering in the clouds, but everybody knows there will be no rain. So in other words, a couple, they have an argument, but they have such a sense of value in each other and the relationship. It's like lightning. It says boom, and then it's gone. And the difficulty is when couples don't value the relationship, they don't cultivate friendship, shared activity, don't have an affectionate relationship, then the relationship can become very dry. Srila Prabhupada once he said, affection was a symptom of life. So when those things are lacking in a relationship, when there is conflict, we live here in British Columbia, which is very, very dry in the summer. It's not uncommon here to have forest fires. You can have one booming thunder and a bolt of lightning. You can start a fire that can burn 100,000 acres in 1 or 2 months. That's not uncommon. And that's pretty much the case in many marriages today. They become devoid of affection, friendship, devoid of shared activity. Relationship is very dry. And then there's some friction, some fight, and boom, huge forest fire. So conflict resolution is a skill that you can learn. And again, going back to Bhutabara, you can pray to Krishna to help you navigate these kind of challenges. You can make the endeavor to get some skills to be able to overcome these kind of problems. Now, can you put up the next? I'll just explain this first before you put the poll up. So here's one. Living together is a good test before marriage. Now, I don't mean this to be a judgment on anyone, especially in our work. We deal with a lot of couples, a lot of young couples, second generation. And because of the disasters that the second gens and many devotees have observed in ISKCON in relationship to marriage, there's a lot of devotees who are very disillusioned by marriage, and they actually fear entering into marriage because of what they've seen in the society and outside the society. So I'm extremely sympathetic to that. I honor that. I understand that. And this is not meant to be a judgment on anyone. But I would just like to share some personal experience and some things from research. So as Uttama was mentioning, this is a photograph of a girl I met in 1971. And we actually decided not to get married. We decided not to get married. I'll tell you what happened after we do the poll. So living together is a good test before marriage. True, it's a good test. False, it's not a good test, or you're not sure. So can you administer the poll now?
So about 80% have voted. Do you want to share the results?
Sure, share the results. So 24% thought it was a good test. 48 thought it was not a good test, and significantly 27% weren't sure. So we can close that. So I'll tell you what happened. So I graduated, my wife was finishing her last term in high school, and she told her father, well, we were just going to live together. And he hit the roof. It was a volatile conflict. And so she told her father, she said, all right, we'll get married. And so we were both legally underage. So we both had to get our parents to sign legal papers to allow that they would allow us to get married. And so they signed the papers. And then a few days later, we had a courthouse wedding with two of our friends. We did not invite our parents, no one. And they were shocked. They were so shocked. And then practically the day after my wife graduated, we just threw whatever few possessions we had in this little old English car we had and just headed off for the West Coast, just looking for some other kind of life. And they were even more shocked. Our parents were even more shocked. And then a year and a half later, we became Hare Krishnas, and then they were even more shocked. And actually, after we joined, we had a temple, we gave all our money to the temple. So the temple president, he rented a big hall and they had a big festival and he performed a wedding for us. And we invited our parents. But they were so shocked and disillusioned by what we had done that they didn't even come to that. And then fast forward 25 years maybe, and my eldest daughter's getting married. And I'm sitting at the fire sacrifice, looking at my daughter, and just realizing, wow, all of a sudden she just turned into this young lady. And I looked around, there's my mom and dad and my wife's parents and my sister and her brothers and family friends. And it hit me like a ton of bricks that, oh my God, I cheated my parents out of this experience. I just completely cheated my parents. I put a whole different perspective on it. So from one perspective, the marriage is actually not just about you, but it's actually about your entire community and your family and your extended family. They want to come together and offer their blessings to you. So it is an extremely important samskar and social event. And in terms of statistics, and again, this is not meant as a judgment on anyone who's living together. I know many couples are doing this, and I have great sympathy for that, and I honor that 100%. But statistically, it's shown that what is missing is when a couple cohabitates before marriage is sometimes if they're just trying it out, they haven't got that full sense of commitment because they're thinking, well, if it doesn't work, we can just bail out. Whereas in marriage, you make this very, very solid commitment. It's referred to as a constraint commitment. So in all marriages, there's going to be difficulties and challenges and obstacles and difficult times. But in those moments of great difficulty, we can actually take strength in the fact that, well, I promised before the deity, before the Vaishnava, before my parents, that I was going to make this work. And sometimes that can actually save you, that sense of constraint commitment. So it's a very important thing that can help you in those difficult times. And then there's also a very important angle that it was actually something that Srila Prabhupada desired. He wanted his disciples to get married and live together. And again, going to back, I honor that devotees are disillusioned with what they've seen in marriage in ISKCON. And that's one of the reasons why we as the Grihastha Vision Team do what we're doing. We're trying to make up for that wrong, how our society neglected the importance of marriage, didn't give encouragement to couples who were married. In the past, the brahmachari got married and the brahmachari got married, the fire sacrifice, and then more or less everyone just came up and said, congratulations, good luck, goodbye. You're kind of on your own. And that's a huge struggle for many devotees. Many individuals had no role models of what a successful marriage looked like. No support, no encouragement, and extremely difficult for them. So now what we do, especially in Canada, we made it I don't like to use the word mandate or policy, but in Canadian temples, if you want to get married in an ISKCON temple, it's actually a requirement that you get some premarital mentorship first. And so the idea is that we do not want to mandate this, but we want this to be a part of our culture, that we don't simply perform marriages. We also want to support and nurture marriages. We want to give support to couples. It just brings back, I just recalled one devotee in Brazil telling us he got married, and then one of his brahmachari friends gave him a present. He unwraps it. There's a bucket with a rope and a flashlight in it for the deep, dark well. Now, is that an encouraging way to start your ashram? No, it's like terrible. So marriage, it's very important. So in a minute, we're just going to go into a breakout group. If you want to set that up in Madhava, you can just let me know when you're ready. We'd like to examine the question. Sorry, Madhava?
How many people would you like per room?
Can you do about 8 or 10 in a group?
Yeah, and another thing, the participants are just having a hard time hearing you. So if you can just come closer to the mic.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, I might have a little, not the greatest internet connection here.
That's better. That's much better.
So how long till you have the breakout room ready? Ready to go. Okay, I'm just going to show a slide here. So here the question for your group is, women are difficult to understand. Is this true or is this false? So as a group, I'd like you to have a spokesperson and a person to take notes, and likely because you're at different locations, the spokesperson should also take notes. So if you can just kind of elect someone to be a spokesperson, that spokesperson can take notes from your conclusions. And if we can get audio to each group, we'll take feedback from each group, or as many groups as we can. So, so the task is, women are difficult to understand, yes or no? So, Madhava, can you break them into groups? And we'll give you about 5 minutes to discuss that.
All right. So, Hare Krishna, please accept my humble obeisance. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. So the overall consensus that I captured in our group is that I think that we ultimately said it's hard to understand women unless we spend the time to educate ourselves and understand the biology and psychology of women. Then it becomes easy. That was the overall, what I took away.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Okay, the next group.
I'll just mention Nakula was the one person in our group that says it's easy. So if any of the men out there are having problems after the seminar, you can talk to Nakula. He's got a lot of suggestions.
We're going to sign him up for the Grihastha Vision Team.
That's right. It's good. It's good.
We have a spokesperson from another person. Maybe you can either raise a little hand icon or wave your arms and speak.
Hare Krishna, please go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Lokanath from Johannesburg. And in our group, not everyone got a chance to speak, but some of the points that were raised are that one can learn a pattern and understand and predict certain behavior. So in that way, it can be easier. And then also it can be a challenge because one can expect certain type of behavior based on one's own behavior, and that doesn't work very well. And then another point was that Srila Prabhupada gives explanations in his purports about the psychology, and in that way we can understand women. And then there was some discussion about solutions such as taking responsibility as a man and being a forerunner and having strong spiritual life, and then being able to lead from the front. Hare Krishna.
Thank
We
you
have
so
another
much,
group.
Prabhu. Yeah, I have Anuttama Prabhu here from Calgary who has raised his hand. Maybe he can speak.
Hare Krishna. So please accept my humble obeisance, all glory to Srila Prabhupada. So what we found it mostly true. There's a consensus on that, and we mentioned that men tend to be more straightforward in their communication. There's also women, they say certain things, but they don't often mean it. And women tend to have a better intuition with respect to emotions, but they don't compartmentalize things like we do. And they tend to be a little more spontaneous, whereas we tend to be more of a planning and more rigid in that perspective. And they can be harder to predict as well. So, yeah. Hare Krishna.
Thank you, Prabhu. Okay, we have Vivek Prabhu from Saskatoon.
Hare Krishna, everyone. So again, we didn't get everybody to talk, especially Maharaj. Sorry about that. One of the answers was on material platform. It's very difficult to understand women. Another one was at times we are coming from selfish or male-oriented point of view. So we need to understand that better and understand the women's point of view as well in order to come up with a proper understanding. And it's difficult to understand the needs of a woman as they are more emotional. Women do not give straight answers. Men expect direct answers. So by the time we get the answer, yes or no, there's been conflicts in between. So that's all. Hare Krishna.
Partha Prabhu, do we have some time for some more, or?
Let's take one more group.
One more? Okay, we have Robert Smith as well, who had raised his hand. Go ahead, Robert.
My men friends. So ours was pretty straightforward. We came to the conclusion that men are from Mars and women are from Venus. And our second conclusion that was only the minimum term for marriage was 12 years, except one individual who was 2 years. And the consensus of all the men from 12 years were beyond were, yes, it's very difficult to understand women. And the newlywed said, well, I don't know, it's not so bad. So we mentioned to him that he needs just a few more years and he'll be in our camp. Yeah, so.
We have done similar exercises in 21 different countries, and actually done them online in many other countries. And it's very interesting. The conclusions are the same. One devotee we were talking with said from Indonesia, how it was this way in Indonesia, but actually it's the same everywhere. That the men perceive that women, they aren't so straightforward as men. They perceive that women are more emotional. Some of the men are kind of getting the idea, they understood that, well, if they make a concentrated effort to actually understand their wives, they can understand them. Some of the men also identified that if they get some skills in the differences between men and women in terms of their psychophysical natures, that can help them to understand. And so yes, women are very difficult to understand. And largely the big difference is because we as men are sometimes listening to the wrong thing. Again, it's like Bhutta Bhavana's, your wife's talking about the Hershey candy under the cup, but it's not just the Hershey candy under the cup, but she's also talking about the other hand that came in, and the fact there's blue and green cups that are coming in and out of the pictures. And we don't get that because we don't see the way she's seeing. And so sometimes you experience women become very frustrated because we don't actually, we think they're not being straightforward, but they're speaking in a different way. And it's also noticeable that how the devotee is in very newly married to say no problem, but the more you spend time with your wife, it can become more difficult to learn to communicate and understand. And that's also extremely, extremely common. So again, this is it's not a problem, it's a challenge. And it's a challenge that we as men, it's very important that we address because we understand that women need to be protected. And so for men, we got that. We built the house, we buy the groceries, we maintain the car. That's our job. We got that down. But for women, protection also means it's very important for us as men to understand there's also a little duck that comes in that picture. And that little duck that we don't see is that women have a very primal need for emotional connection, and especially with their significant others, their spouses. And when women are unable to connect emotionally with their husbands, they tend to become frustrated and isolated. And for women, the greatest fear for women is the fear of isolation. And when we as men can't connect with our wives emotionally, that tends to make them feel a little isolated. And sometimes when they feel isolated, they'll come back to us and they'll say, well, you don't understand. And we become bewildered because we just heard something that sounded logical to us. There was a Hershey cup under the cup. I saw it move around and it's right there. That's the problem. Don't worry about it. She says, no, you don't understand. There was a duck. There was a duck there for a second. Didn't you see that? So we as guys, we don't get that they have a need. The duck is, they have a need for emotional connection. We may hear what they're saying as a problem for us to solve, out of our goodwill and our loving intent. But often women, they do not want a solution. They just want you to say, if I understood you correctly, I'm guessing that you're feeling, frustrated, or you're feeling a little alone, or you're feeling anxiety. And for the women, it's like, yeah, they just want a little bit of emotional empathy. And that's actually one extremely important thing that men can do to make their wives feel supported and loved, is just to learn to acknowledge their emotions. And sometimes that's fearful for men, because men sometimes fear, as Yadernoth was saying, how, we've grown up in this culture that men don't cry, they don't have these kind of feelings, we're tough. And so we tend not to really be so able to access our emotions and understand other people's emotions. But to have a successful, healthy marriage, that's one skill as men. It's very important that we learn. And it's not that difficult. And as I was saying, sometimes you don't understand your wife, where she's coming from. Just try saying, well, I'm guessing you're feeling, take a shot at it. And just the fact you reached out to try to understand, she's going to feel you care about her. If you say, well, the problem is you didn't do this or that, you're just going to run into a stone wall. And there's sometimes she may want a solution, and if you can't tell the difference, you can ask. Sometimes my wife, I don't understand if she wants empathy or she's got a problem she wants solved. I'll just come right out and ask her, are you looking for me to understand you, or is this a problem you want me to help you solve? I'll just come out and ask. And so that's a very important part of marriage, is understanding that necessity for developing that emotional intelligence. And in relationship with this, I'd like to now just bring up the next quiz now, which is about vulnerability. Actually, we don't have a slide for that.
I can do that. Do you want me to launch it?
Yeah, launch the quiz. So masculinity and vulnerability are contradictory. If you're having a hard time, just what's your gut feeling? Okay, we got 57 respondents. So 19% thought that it is that masculinity and vulnerability were contradictory, and another 9% weren't sure. So that's getting close to 30% of us thought that masculinity and vulnerability are contradictory. And it's encouraging that 42% realize that no, men can actually be vulnerable. This is a very important topic. You can close this. We can examine this in terms of our Vaishnava theology. Who's one of the greatest warriors you can think of is Arjuna, personal friend of Krishna, extremely powerful. I mean, the greatest archer ever. And he's on the battlefield before the Battle of Kurukshetra, and he completely breaks down, His arms are quivering, he's drying up, and he's just completely bewildered, and he takes shelter of Krishna. That's vulnerability. To realize you are vulnerable, that Krishna, please help me. Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada was a superhero. If anyone's a superhero, it was Srila Prabhupada. Came alone to New York City with the equivalent of $7 US. He arrives in New York with nothing. Prabhupada literally said when he got off the boat, he didn't know whether to turn left or right. And Srila Prabhupada wrote this beautiful poem on the Jaladuta. I think it was in Boston Harbor. He said, "My dear Lord Krishna, I have no idea why you brought me here. Krishna, why did you bring me here? I have no idea. What can I say to these people? I have no idea what I'm going to say to these people." That's vulnerable. That is being really vulnerable. And in that vulnerable position, he took complete shelter of Krishna. And we see the result of taking shelter of Krishna in those vulnerable moments. Srila Prabhupada, wow, is he empowered? Complete empowered. Was Arjuna empowered? Wow, was he empowered? And as Bhutta Bhavana was saying, that us as individually, as Vaishnavas, we have to see how to tap into that empowerment, that in all situations in our life, we should look for that kind of vulnerability, that can I do this alone, or Krishna, can you help me? Can we access that? And so vulnerability, it's in terms of Vaishnava theology, it's a very important part of our philosophy. And even in terms of the masculinity of the material world, if you're familiar at all with extreme sports, these athletes who are doing all kinds of extremely dangerous things, they are also aware of their vulnerability. These guys, it scares the crap out of them, but they weigh the risks. They make extremely calculated risks. They are scared, and they're actually getting a rush. They are getting off on the adrenaline that comes from that fear. That's why people are so interested in extreme sports, because you get this adrenaline rush, and it's a very unique feeling. And so they're getting off, but they're addressing their vulnerability, and they're making very calculated decisions. In British Columbia here, we have some of the most rugged mountains in North America, and there's a lot of outdoor sports, especially in the winter. And there's a lot of people who die in the woods, get killed by avalanches, get completely lost. And those are the guys who think they're the guys who think they're invulnerable. You know, I don't need a map, I don't need a compass, I'm just going to go off there, nothing can happen to me. And they find out that stuff happens when you're not prepared. The guys that are successful, they weigh the risk. They know it's scary. And if you're going off in the mountains, there's always a chance of an avalanche in the winter. So these guys, they weigh the risks. So it is actually normal and actually healthy for men to address that kind of internal vulnerability. And so that manifests as seeing our own weaknesses, And also it very much involves reading our emotions, because emotions are like gauges. The purpose of emotion is to, actually from the Greek, emotion meant to put something in motion. So emotion is meant to set us moving in a certain direction. And so if we're not perceptive to our emotions, we will not be able to read the direction our emotions are trying to tell us and make the necessary movements we need to take. In Canada recently, it was a study done. They found that in the last 10 years, the suicide rate amongst men went up 10%. And that was quite remarkable, quite a big jump. Whereas the women's suicide rate remained stable. It was the same as it had been for many, many years. And they tried to understand, why did the men's rate jump in the last 10 years? And they attributed it to toxic masculinity, that our male egotistical nature to try and bury our emotions and to be tough and just suck it up and keep going. Some situations, maybe that's good. You're playing sports and it hurts, you keep on playing. Well, that's okay. But sometimes in life, sometimes you need to pay attention to your emotions. For instance, men have a higher rate of mental illness, higher rates of heart disease, higher rates of early death, because they neglect and ignore the signals their body is trying to tell them. Whereas women tend to be much more aware of their emotions, especially for those of you who are married. You're well aware that a certain time in the month, your wife will become extremely emotional. And often for men, that's very difficult to do. They become very difficult to understand. But actually, that's also, again, an opportunity for men to offer their wife some support by trying to help them understand their emotions. Sometimes my wife would get really emotional, and she's trying to peek in the door. And I'd say, well, what are you feeling? And she'd say, I don't know. And I would just say, well, if you did know, what do you think it might be? And she would just start to think at it from a different angle and stuff would start to come out. So for women, in a sense, that's actually very valuable, because things come to the surface and they work it out. Whereas for us men, sometimes we don't let it come to the surface and we bury it. And for some men, so much gets buried and becomes so compressed, and then eventually people commit suicide. A larger number of men are committing suicide because they don't know how to access and understand their emotions. So that's something that we as a community of men really need to address and understand. And I believe there's a panel tomorrow on masculinity, which is going to, address the masculine nature of what does it actually look like, and what is healthy masculinity as opposed to toxic masculinity. And so again, we get these kind of messages from society about men are tough. And there was the Marlboro man as a kid, like the guy with the black eye would rather get punched in the eye than quit smoking. That was the image that was portrayed. But that's extremely unhealthy. But so we should think in terms of Vaishnava masculinity and the examples that are set by, our great acharyas, how they just felt themselves completely dependent on Krishna, completely unable, completely incompetent, just submitted themselves at Krishna's lotus feet. And they're also empowered by that sense of dependence on Krishna. And so if you're not feeling yourself vulnerable and not realizing how infinitesimal you are, not realizing your deep inner emotions, it's going to be very hard for you to be vulnerable and become dependent on Krishna. And this is also extremely important in terms of the ultimate goal of life, which, as Bhakta Bhavana was saying, is something, it's pure love of God. It's on the horizon. It may be a distant point on the horizon, but that's on the horizon, and that's what we're going for. And if we think of pure love of God, it's filled with emotion, it's filled with loving exchanges of emotion between Krishna and the cowherd boys and the gopis and Mother Yasoda and Krishna. There's such subtle, powerful emotions. I was just reading a few days ago how when Mother Yasoda began to chase Krishna, he saw her coming. And Krishna was thinking, he's standing by this grinding pestle. And Krishna said, well, all the yogis, they can just enter into the atom, and I'm Krishna. I give the yogis this power. So my mother's coming, so I'm just going to enter into the atoms in this pestle, and she won't be able to find me and chastise me with that stick. So Krishna tried to enter into the atoms of the grinding pestle. He couldn't do it. And he was thinking, what's happening? Krishna couldn't understand. He's the Supreme Personality of Godhead, source of all incarnations, the source of everything. He couldn't do it. He couldn't enter into the pestle. And he couldn't do it because Mother Yasoda has such strong love that she lovingly wanted to discipline her son. That love actually suppressed his ability as a supreme person to enter into atoms. So how can we understand this? Inconceivable to us. And the only way we will be able to fully comprehend and understand and appreciate those exalted spiritual emotions when we begin to access the emotions within the core of our beings. And that's why Rupa Goswami, he recommends this loving exchange of reveal your minding and confidence and hearing and confidence. You exchange what's going on in your life, what you're feeling, your hopes and aspirations, and you understand each other. And in marriage, you actually have a great opportunity for that. And again, especially as men, for us to be successful in our spiritual life and in our Grihastha ashrams, that's one great challenge that we have to overcome, is that conditioning from society that is inhibiting our ability to access our inner emotions. And I know I will admit that my wife really helped me work through that. And she just started talking to me about feelings once about it, and she started to get something on, and she would say, why do you feel that? And then she kept asking kind of curious questions about why, and it just kind of helped me to penetrate and just realize that I actually had a lot kind of blocked up inside. And so the conclusion is that vulnerability is not something to be fearful of. Vulnerability can be fearful. I'll admit myself, I am extreme and extrovert. Whenever I'm before public speaking, I'm extremely fearful. I'm extreme anxiety. Once I'm speaking, I'm okay. But I just know that my only hope is if I take shelter of Krishna, and it works. I'll testify it works. You take shelter of Krishna, somehow he'll put some words in your mouth and people won't throw tomatoes at you. So it's extremely important. I'm going to save some time for questions. So I'm just going to go to the end to our conclusion, and then we'll take some questions. Oops, just done. So in conclusion, we should be conscious about the myths and paradigms in our environment, and we should only accept ones that resonate with our values. So, and that's especially relevant to this idea of masculinity and vulnerability. That's an extremely important value, that we have to untangle those negative paradigms about men being invincible and not emotional. It's something that we really have to address as a society. And if you're interested in more information on things we've been talking about, These links will be posted below. We have a website with all kinds of resources, VaishnavFamilyResources.org. We have a Facebook page called Grihastha Vision Team. And especially I talked somewhat about values. And our group, everything we do is based upon what we call the 12 principles of successful Grihastha life. We examine the challenges faced by Grihasthas and try to understand what teachings of Srila Prabhupada were maybe misunderstood or misrepresented, what kind of inappropriate paradigms and attitudes caused those problems. And then we looked at what values, if were promoted and propagated and imbibed, would cure those problems or prevent them from happening in the first place. So that's also, the 12 principles are on the website. So all in there, and if anyone has any questions, we can field a few questions.
Partha, we have some questions that have been coming up in the chat box. We just got about 12 minutes to go, so I'm
Okay,
gonna merge a couple of these together. There's a couple of questions about emotional intelligence. How do we develop it more, and how do we give more emotional empathy to our wives?
I think the important one, you can start by trying to give more empathy to your wives and just ask them, how are you feeling? Can you help me? Just ask them, can you help me understand that? What does that feel like to you? You don't have to agree with it, and you don't have to necessarily even feel what they're feeling. An important way you can develop it is you ask them what they're feeling and then repeat that back in your own words. That, she might say, I went to work and, it was too hot today in the office and everything seemed to go wrong. And it was like just horrible and everyone was complaining all day. And so as a male guy, he might say, well, I'll go there tomorrow and I'll fix the air conditioning and I'll just go talk to your coworkers, tell them to just behave a little more properly. She'll probably just get frustrated at you. But you could try to understand, and you could just say, well, I'm guessing that you're feeling, it must have been very uncomfortable and frustrating for you. You take a guess. And she might say yes. And then you can ask her, well, can you tell me more? And I mean, what you'll experience is a sense of connection. It's not just intellectually you're trying to understand, okay, you felt this emotion, X, Y, Z, and it's just some clinical thing. But you're actually connecting with your spouse's or the other person's emotional world. And that's a very meaningful connection. And as you start to do that, you will actually start to feel that connection. And just a one tip for men, men tend to look for physical connection. Women look for emotional connection. Women cannot think of physical connection unless they're emotionally connected. Men have a hard time thinking of emotional connection unless they're physically connected. That's an enigma. That's a puzzle. And that's something couples have to understand and try to work out. That's one of these, can even be challenge or conflict. But you have to begin somewheres and make the effort and try. There's all kinds of resources on empathic listening, reflective listening, nonviolent communication. You can Google anything today. So just make that effort and start somewhere. As Bhakti Marg Swami is famous for saying, the journey of a 3,000 miles starts with the first step, right, Maharaj? You just start. And what was the other part, how we can develop emotional intelligence?
Yeah, I think you kind of did both of them. I think
Okay.
you did both.
Okay.
There's another question. Okay, so once we understand the problem, we know what's right. Why is it difficult sometimes for us to take that right step in our relationships?
I think that's called conditioning. We know it's right. We know it's going to be better for the relationship. And ultimately, sometimes we know it's going to feel better, but we kind of have this ego. We get conditioned to the way things are. But if we're not fully satisfied, why should we hold back in taking a step that's going to improve things? And in reality, that's why we're in the material world. We become conditioned to a lesser state of consciousness and think that's normal. But Srila Prabhupada, he wanted us to be happy. That's like if it boiled down to everything. Actually, Anuttama Prabhu and his wife Rukmini, they had a call with Krishnanandini just shortly before she left this world, and they asked for some advice. And what did she say, Anuttama? She just said, be happy.
Yeah, one of the things she said was just be joyful in your Krishna
Yeah,
consciousness.
be joyful, be joyful. So we as men in marriage, we have this responsibility to become joyful in ourselves and to make our spouses joyful and our families joyful. It doesn't mean there's not going to be challenges, there's not going to be difficulties. There will be difficult times. Just like I climbed a mountain once. It was actually horrendous. It's an exciting adventure, but there's a part of the climb where it's just like horrendous. Like, what am I doing here, risking my life? I'm completely annoyed with the person I'm doing it with. But I knew, okay, we want to do this, and we worked through it, and like we're really good friends because of that. We've worked through that. So marriage is a bit like that. It's an adventure. There's going to be challenges, and even in the challenging times, you know you have that goal, and ultimately working through the challenge will help you become more joyful and more connected and more close.
Can you talk a little bit about, there was a question that came up, you talk about vulnerability as men. We live in a society still today that, maybe the Marlboro Man's not so popular, but other images in the popular media and the world at large, and even in our community sometimes, if you're vulnerable, you're less masculine. How do we open up and be what you're suggesting we should be? How do you overcome that pressure to be the tough, strong, silent, suffering type?
We need to understand the goal, and we need healthy role models. And we should actually, we have all these superhero, today's really a superhero culture, like Iron Man, this man, that man, Batman, Spider-Man, and superheroes. But really, we have our superhero acharyas who've done like such amazing things. And so we really need to study what drove them. Prabhupada, Abhay Charan, he's fearless, but Prabhupada expressed that vulnerability. That's what made him fearless. The fact that he felt vulnerable and he completely could take shelter of Krishna, that made him fearless. So it's that vulnerability that gives us real fearlessness, because fearlessness without vulnerability can be foolishness.
Yeah, explain that a little more. There's a couple questions coming up, like with confidentiality. Part of being vulnerable is you're opening yourself up. Mm-hmm. So talk about confidentiality a little bit, and who do you know? How do you know who you can trust? That's one of our 6 loving exchanges. How do you know and where? And
that's a very good person. There's a very famous psychologist, Brené Brown. She does a seminar, and she asks people to write on a piece of paper the names of people who they can feel completely open and they can be completely vulnerable with. And she gives them a piece of paper this size. It's about 1 inch square. So you're not going to be able to be vulnerable with everyone. You're not going to pour your heart out to everyone you meet, because some people are not confidential, and that is can be extremely detrimental. And I know devotees, they reveal their mind and heart to someone, and the next day they hear the whole community, oh, did you hear so-and-so's having this problem? He was shattered. Is he going to be able to reveal his mind again to someone else? It's going to be very hard. And many devotees have experienced that. And that's also a very big problem we experience, that we hear all over the world, that devotees have a very hard time getting that kind of trust where they can reveal their minds. And so that's something we really have to develop, that culture of, Rupa Goswami says, not just revealing your mind, but revealing your mind in confidence. And confidence is a very sacred thing. If you break that confidence, trust is lost. And when you lose trust, the relationship's never going to be the same. So we have to cultivate, that's something we have to cultivate as a society, especially within your marriages. And within your marriage, it's very important that you develop that. That's one great asset of marriage. You have someone you can have confidence in, and you can reveal your heart and mind to without fear of being judged. And it's very important that you may have to develop that by not being judgmental of your spouse. And they will also have to be not judgmental of you, but just to hear in confidence and understand.
So
it's something that has to go ahead, Marsh.
It starts with setting an example ourselves, you're saying. That's
Yes.
a part of it.
Yeah.
Let me roll. It's just a couple minutes left, just to roll a couple questions together about vulnerability. One of the devotees commented that it's hard. He finds it's hard for women if we try to be vulnerable women, because they've got their stereotypical idea of this, heartless as heartless man. So sometimes it may be hard for women to accept when we try to be vulnerable. And then another devotee is asking, well, what about, can you go too far? Be too vulnerable, be too willing to just trying to please others. And apparently there's some ideas out there in the society at large that we can swing too far that way. Men can become too soft or too much disinterested in pleasing others and not standing for principle. So comment on that a little bit if you could.
Yeah, we don't have to reveal everything. Even to our spouses, we don't have to reveal everything. But if you become sensitive internally and internally aware, you realize what's important. And those are the kind of things you might have to sit down with your spouse and say, just, can you really help me with this? I need you to listen to me on this. So wait, internally become, if it's important. It's a nice example of personal introspection. Kardama Muni, he performed austerities for 100 celestial years. And then he saw Lord Vishnu descending on the back of Garuda. And after 100 celestial years of being introspective, Kardama Muni said to Lord Vishnu, my dear Lord, I think I need a wife of like disposition. In the 70s and 80s, everyone would have said, Prabhu, you're in Maya. Lord Vishnu said, yeah, actually, there's a princess who's got a crush on you, and her dad, Swayambhu Vamana, is coming here in a few days with her. So he was internally aware. So we need to do that kind of internal introspection and learn to become aware within ourselves.
So in part, vulnerability starts with ourselves. And if we have an honest sense of that, then we'll have more wisdom in knowing where and how and whom to be vulnerable with in our life. Yeah, that's great. Well, Partha Prabhu, this is a very enlightening and enlivening presentation. Really appreciate it. Among other things, I didn't know how many mountains you've climbed in your life. I know you come to the
first and last.
That was first. It seemed like there was a few there that you described in telling your story. But thank you very much. In part, revealing your own vulnerability about your own situation, your experience with your daughter's marriage, and looking back, reflecting on what was the impact on your family decisions you made so many years ago. I think that's important for all of us too, to become to learn from you this principle, being a little self-reflective and self-critical. And I think part of the purpose of this whole retreat is to give us an opportunity to share these kind of thoughts in association with other men, to allow us to kind of be more flexible and maybe be more open and be able to bring up stuff like, hey, is this an issue for you, or how do you deal with that? There was a final kind of a general question about how do we, in general, how did you make your marriage stronger and all these kind of things. And for that one, I would refer everyone to the resources online you've directed devotees to. Maybe you can just mention those again. Grihastha, I think actually they were put up in the chat.
Yeah, they're going to post them below.
I think done to put in the chat. Okay, great. So please, everybody, take advantage of those. Those are great resources. Thank you again, Partha. And in a minute, we're going to just, in half a minute, we're going to ask everybody to take off mute, and we're going to offer you our collective appreciation. Just want to remind everybody, this is our longer break now. We're going to be back in East Coast time, USA. It'll be 7 o'clock. It's 5 hours from now for all of us. The next session is Mahatma Prabhu, looking at this challenge that's there. Partha talked about challenges, and pornography is something we know and please don't feel like coming to the sessions means you're acknowledging I have some difficulty with this. It's a difficulty that affects men. Maybe we've never had an issue with it whatsoever. Maybe it's something we struggle with. Maybe it's never even crossed our mind, but it's out there for other men. So if for no other reason, as fathers, as brothers, as sons, as cousins, as preachers, we need to understand how this thing is affecting negatively society out there. And it does sometimes affect devotional communities, men in our devotee communities as well. Mahatma is going to be presenting that. He's an excellent speaker and presenter. He's done a lot of research to bring to our advantage. And then we're going to end with a beautiful kirtan by Amala Harinam Prabhu. Just we ended last night with Gauravani. So please tune back in. It's 5 hours from now. And Anandamata, you can collectively unmute, or maybe we individually unmute ourselves, and everybody is so our gratitude to Partha Prabhu.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prabhuji.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prabhu.
Hare
Thank you so much,
Krishna.
Prabhuji.
Gauranga, Hare Krishna. Haribo.
Prabhupada.
Okay, we'll see everyone.
Hare Krishna. Haribo.
Hare Krishna.